Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, commonly known as Pompey, one of the most distinguished military commanders and political figures in the late Roman Republic. His early career was marked by victories in Africa, Sicily, and the eastern Mediterranean, not only expanding Rome's territories, but also giving himself quite a reputation. His ascent to power was strategically bolstered through the formation of the First Triumvirate, alongside Julius Caesar and Crassus, an alliance with names that you're no doubt familiar with. But tensions within this alliance eventually led to its dissolution, and Pompey's ensuing rivalry with Julius Caesar set the stage for a conflict that would alter the course of Roman history. Hello and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, good to meet you, and if you come back, good to see you again. Now, if you want to support the channel, you're already doing it. Just come here, have a good time, and learn something. But the like and subscribe are only 2 clicks away, and if you feel inclined to go further than that, take a look in the description of the video. Now, without any further ado, let's all get nice and comfortable, nice and relaxed, and we can begin a rather deep dive into the life of Pompey. Pompey was born on the 29th of September, 106 BC, in Picenum, as the eldest son of one Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, a provincial noble. Now Strabo was from a prominent family in Picenum, and he was the first to attain senatorial rank. He followed the traditional cursus honorum, achieving the consulship in 89 BC, and was unfortunately noted for his greed, cunning, and ruthless approach to military command, and that's quite a reputation. Well, Pompey, his early career saw him serving alongside his father during the Social War between 91 and 87 BC. Strabo's life came to an abrupt end in 87 amidst the brief civil conflict known as the Bellum Octavianum. The exact circumstance of his death is a little bit of a mystery, but some accounts suggest natural causes. Of course, there are many who allege murder by his own troops, which could have happened as well, and wouldn't be much of a surprise considering his reputation. There are also accusations of embezzlement that marred Strabo's final days, and as his heir, Pompey also faced charges for these alleged crimes, but ultimately he was acquitted, reportedly after securing a political alliance through marriage to Antistia, who was actually the daughter of the presiding judge. No doubt raises a few eyebrows, I'm sure. Now, the year 87 BC was also a significant one for the debate over the appointment of Lucius Cornelius Sulla as commander of the Roman forces in the First Mithridatic War, a position that of course promised substantial wealth. In Sulla's absence, his political adversaries, including Lucius Cornelius Cinna and Gnaeus Papirius Carbo, seized control of the Senate, along with a little help from Gaius Marius. Sulla's return in 83 ignited a new phase of civil war. Now, in the year leading up to Sulla's return to Italy, Pompey raised and equipped a full legion from his father's former clients and veterans in Picenum. In the spring of 83 BC, as Sulla landed at Brundusium and began his march northwest towards Campania, Pompey led his legion south to meet him. The Roman government, aiming to prevent their union, dispatched 3 separate armies against them. Pompey engaged and defeated one of these forces, causing the enemy commanders, who were conflicted and unable to coordinate their strategies, to retreat. And upon his arrival at Sulla's camp, he was formally greeted with the title of Imperator. Quite a promotion. Sometime in 83 BC, roughly before the winter had set in, Sulla tasked Pompey with returning to Picenum to raise additional troops. The following year, as conflicts resumed, Sulla pushed towards Rome. At the same time, Pompey, supporting Sulla's lieutenant Metellus, confronted the consul Gaius Papirius Carbo in Cisalpine Gaul. Serving as the cavalry commander under Metellus during this period. In a significant engagement, Metellus and Pompey overcame Carbo's lieutenant, the praetor Gaius Carinus, in a prolonged 6-hour battle near the river Aesis. However, they soon found themselves blockaded by none other than Carbo himself. The situation shifted again when news of Sulla's triumph at the Battle of Sacriportus reached them, prompting Carbo to retreat to his stronghold in Arminium. During his retreat, Carbo's forces were continually harassed by Pompey's cavalry. Later, Metellus achieved another victory against Gaius Marcius Censorinus, another of Carbo's lieutenants. Pompey's cavalry played a critical role in these events, intercepting Censorinus's fleeing troops near Senna Gallica, where they secured a decisive victory, and subsequently plundered the entire town. While Metellus continued his campaigns in the northwest, Pompey joined forces with Sulla in the south, marking a significant phase in the civil war that would definitely shake things up back in Rome. Now, Pompey, moving southwest along the Via Flaminia towards Spoletium, joined forces with Crassus. Together, they engaged and defeated Carinus once again. After laying siege to Carinus in Spoletium, Pompey continued his march, while Carinus managed a very narrow escape. His journey resumed towards Sulla's command, and soon after, Pompey successfully ambushed a significant force led by Censorinus, which was attempting to reach Praeneste. This town was the site of a blockade against Marius the Younger, Carbo's consular colleague, and the symbolic leader of the opposition to Sulla. The failure of these forces to break the Sullan blockades in Umbria and Etruria, combined with Metellus's success in securing the north, weakened the government's resistance. As the campaigning season of 82 drew to a close, the government rallied for one last effort to relieve the beleaguered Praeneste, assembling 10,000 legionaries who marched to join the forces with the Samnites and the Lucanians, Sulla's old adversaries from the social war. Pursued by Pompey, these forces merged and advanced towards Praeneste, but, unable to penetrate Sulla's strong blockade, redirected towards a now undefended Rome. However, they were intercepted and defeated by Sulla at the Battle of the Colline Gate. Pompey, in pursuit of these government forces, arrived just after Sulla's victory. And thus we reach the end of 82 BC, where Sulla has successfully expelled his opponents from Italy, and therefore secured his appointment as dictator by the Senate. Now, amidst either respect for Pompey's capabilities or perhaps concern over his rising influence, Sulla aimed to solidify their alliance. He persuaded Pompey to divorce his wife, Antistia, and marry his stepdaughter, Aemilia, although Plutarch does note that this marriage was a short-lived one, as Aemilia, already pregnant by her previous husband, died in childbirth shortly after the wedding. Now, following the defeat of the Marian faction, the remnants fled to Sicily, where they regrouped under one Marcus Perperna, the propraetor and ally. They also had the support of a fleet commanded by Carbo. Meanwhile, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus held control over the Roman province of Africa. Upon Pompey's arrival in Sicily with a formidable force, Perperna vacated the island, while Carbo was captured and subsequently executed, a decision that Pompey defended as completely necessary due to Carbo's crimes against the Roman citizens, or shall we say, alleged. Perhaps Pompey had a little bit of a bias, who knows? However, this ruthless action, partnered with the general sentiment towards him, earned him the pejorative nickname Adulcentulus Carnifex, or, in English we can say, the young butcher. While leaving Sicily under the governance of his brother-in-law, Gaius Memmius, Pompey then set his sights on Africa. It was there he confronted and defeated Ahenobarbus at the Battle of Utica. Following his victory, he swiftly subdued Numidia, executing its king, Hiarbas, who was another ally of the Marian faction, and reinstated the deposed Hiempsal to the Numidian throne. During this campaign, his troops began to call him Magnus, or the Great, likening him to Alexander the Great, a figure who was, of course, deeply admired by the Romans. Pompey eventually adopted this epithet formally into his name, and thus became known as Pompey the Great. Now, upon his return to Rome, Pompey sought a triumph to celebrate his conquests, which was a bold request given his youth. Sulla, while conceding to this request, did attempt to diminish Pompey's spotlight by granting simultaneous triumphs to Lucius Licinius Murena and Gaius Valerius Flaccus. 3 for 1. Well, you take what you can get, don't you? Well, during this period, Pompey also married Mucia Tertia from the influential Metellus family, and the couple had 3 children. Pompey the Younger, who was usually known as Gnaeus. They also had a daughter, Pompeia Magna, and a younger son, finally, named Sixtus. The marriage lasted until their divorce in 61 BC. Now, Pompey initially supported Marcus Aemilius Lepidus for the consulship in 78 BC, a decision that he made against Sulla's advice according to Plutarch, though most contemporary historians do question this assertion. Upon Sulla's death of that same year, Lepidus opposed the deceased dictator's state funeral and sought to immediately repeal some of Sulla's reforms. Shortly after, in January 77 BC, Lepidus assumed the proconsulship of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul. Defying a Senate order to return to Rome, he also demanded an additional term as consul, which the Senate promptly denied. But he wasn't happy with this rebuff, of course. Lepidus assembled an army and marched towards Rome. prompting the Senate to implement several countermeasures. And guess who they chose? Of course, one of which was to assign Pompey the Great a military command to oppose him. Let's see how great he really is. Well, as Lepidus advanced southward, Pompey mobilized troops from among his veteran soldiers in Picenum and moved north to lay siege to Mutina, the capital city of Cisalpine Gaul. Well, if we want to use the word city. Well, either way, it was under control of Lepidus's ally, Marcus Junius Brutus. After enduring a protracted siege, Brutus surrendered the town, but was assassinated the following day, an act that is purportedly ordered by Pompey. Meanwhile, outside Rome, Catulus defeated Lepidus, while Pompey attacked from the rear, trapping him near Cosa. With his forces diminished, Lepidus retreated to Sardinia, where he eventually died. This series of events not only quashed Lepidus's rebellion, but also reinforced Pompey's reputation as a decisive and effective military leader. You got a problem in Rome? You better call Pompey. Now, the Sertorian War erupted quite quickly in 80 BC, when Quintus Sertorius, a formidable leader harboring ties to the Marian faction, launched a rebellion in Hispania. He was soon joined by other Marian survivors, including Perpenna, and backed by local tribes. Sertorius quickly took control of Hispania Citerior. He then successfully forced Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius out of the neighboring Hispania Ulteria, securing his hold over significant portions of the region. Of course, recognizing this escalating threat, the Senate called their boy in charge, the man of the hour, Pompey, appointing him as the military commander in Spain, with complete authority, despite the technical illegality of his appointment, since Pompey had not yet held a public office. But of course, desperate times, desperate measures. And who could say no, right? Well, to confront the formidable Sertorius, Pompey assembled a substantial force of 30,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, which was, of course, a testament to the threat posed by Sertorius. Before reaching Hispania, Pompey quelled a rebellion in Gallia Narbonensis. His troops then settled into winter quarters near Narbo Martius. By early 76 BC, Pompey had crossed the Col de Porte into the Iberian Peninsula, where he would campaign for the next 5 years. Upon his arrival, Pompey's presence bolstered the spirits of Metellus' troops, and he even swayed some of the local rebels to defect. Perhaps, well, seeing 30,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, that may have had a bit of an effect to bring them over to a side that seemed to be numerically superior, of course. However, it wasn't all good news. Campaigns faced setbacks, most notably at the Battle of Lauron, where Sertorius handed him a significant defeat. Of course, no one remembers the 1,000 victories. They'll only remember the one that you lost. And this loss tarnished Pompey's military prestige, prompting him to spend the remainder of the year reorganizing his forces and reflecting on strategic missteps, preparing for a prolonged struggle ahead in the rugged terrain of Hispania. By 75 BC, The Sertorian War saw Quintus Sertorius intensifying his campaign against Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, even as Pompey engaged and defeated Sertorius' subordinates Perpenna and Gaius Herennius outside modern Valencia. As Sertorius personally took command against Pompey, Metellus capitalized on this shift to defeat Sertorius' deputy, Lucius Herculeus, at the Battle of Italica. The war's momentum shifted frequently following the indecisive Battle of Sucro. Sertorius retreated inland, later clashing with Pompey at Saguntum. This battle proved costly for both sides. Pompey lost up to 6,000 men, and he also lost his brother-in-law, Memmius. Sertorius didn't do too well either. He sustained about 3,000 casualties, and lost the very capable Herculeus. Well, despite Metellus achieving a victory over Perpenna in a separate encounter, Sertorius skillfully withdrew to Clunia, and it was there that he reinforced the town's defenses, hoping to draw the Roman generals into a protracted siege, make it difficult for them, starve them out. Well, meanwhile, he organized the garrisons of other towns into a new field army. Once ready, Sertorius broke the siege at Clunia, using his forces to disrupt Roman supply lines, both on land and sea. The logistical strain of all this forced Metellus to winter his troops in Gaul, while Pompey settled among the Vacaei. In 73 BC, bolstered by 2 additional legions, Metellus reunited with Pompey, and they advanced towards the Ebro River. At the same time, Sertorius and Perpenna pushed forward from Lusitania. However, internal divisions began to weaken Sertorius' position, and the conflict stagnated for the next 2 years. By 71, the discord within his ranks culminated in Perpenna assassinating Sertorius. Perpenna's subsequent defeat and execution by Pompey marked the end of major hostilities. So, after consolidating his victory, Pompey spent a bit more time reorganizing the local Roman administration in Hispania. His conciliatory approach toward former opponents not only quelled remaining resistance, but also extended his influence and patronage across Hispania and into southern Gaul, establishing a foundation for future political and military leverage in the region. While Pompey was concluding his military campaigns in Hispania, Crassus took on the responsibility of quelling the Third Servile War. Did you watch my video on it? Well, if you did, you'd know that it was led by the slave Spartacus. That's right, it was that war. Well, Pompey returned to Italy in 71, just as Crassus was delivering the decisive blow against the main rebel army. It was a very long and hard-fought rebellion, I'm sure you know. Pompey's arrival allowed him to engage and massacre 6,000 fugitives from the battle, a move that he claimed as effectively ending the war. Of course, you can't rebel if you're not breathing. They're powerless without their heads, it seems. Well, from memory they were all crucified, as a warning, placed along the roads as they marched new slaves through. Certainly getting the point across, I think so. Well, this assertion became a lingering source of irritation for Crassus, who thought that his efforts were overshadowed by Pompey coming in at the last moment and taking all of the credit. Well, upon his return, Pompey was granted a second triumph for his victories in Hispania, and was nominated for the consulship. Given his youth and the technical breach of eligibility requirements, his nomination required a special decree from the Senate. Now, Plutarch notes in his writings that Pompey supported Crassus as his co-consul, perhaps strategically placing Crassus in his debt, owing him a favor. You know what I mean. The two were elected as consuls eventually for the year 70 BC, yet their term was marked by constant disagreement, leading to a tenure described as, I quote, from Plutarch, politically barren and without achievement. Sounds like a lot of modern politicians, to be honest. Well, despite the conflicts between them, the consulship witnessed significant political changes, notably the restoration of powers to the plebeian tribune that had been stripped by Sulla. Among these powers was the critical ability to veto senatorial bills, a pivotal moment in politics of the late Roman Republic. Now, while this restoration was popular among the populace, it faced opposition from the senatorial class, particularly the optimates. A successful reinstatement of these powers required cooperation between the consuls, a noteworthy achievement given the general contentious nature of their partnership. Now, although most historical accounts focus very little on Crassus's role in these reforms, his support, alongside Pompey's, can't be written off. In fact, it was indispensable for their enactment, so give him some credit. Anyway, pirates. You know them, you love them, and they're not a new thing. In fact, in Roman times, the Mediterranean was quite full of them, and they'd been a significant threat in the time of Pompey, forging temporary alliances with Rome's adversaries, such as Mithridates and Sertorius over the last 50 years. Their influence grew due to the decline of traditional naval powers like Rhodes, and despite previous efforts, Rome had failed to subdue them. There were just too many, they were too spread out, and they just kept coming. Now, it is important to note that Romans often labeled their enemies as pirates or brigands, which leads some historians to argue that these were kind of conventional enemies, rather than mere disorganized outlaws. Think about the way that Romans would refer to anyone who's not Roman as a barbarian, but the word barbarian conjures a certain image in our minds, don't you think? So, when they say that they're pirates, or brand them all with that broad brush, it might not really be the case. Either way, the pirates were mainly based in Cilicia, and they escalated their activities to the extent of raiding Ostia, which was a Roman port, in 68 BC, and they even had the gall to kidnap 2 senators, which of course caused widespread panic and outrage. In response, Aulus Gabinius, a tribune of the plebs in 67 BC, and prompted by Pompey, proposed what was called the Lex Gabinia. This law, this Lex Gabinia, granted Pompey proconsular authority for 3 years over any province within 50 miles of the Mediterranean, and this empowered him to appoint legates and allocate significant financial resources for a campaign against the pirates. Despite Senate opposition due to concerns over one man holding such extensive power, what could possibly go wrong? The Lex Gabinia was ultimately passed by the tribunate. Pompey's campaign faced internal obstacles, primarily from Roman officials who resented his expansive authority, either out of jealousy or practicality. For instance, in Gaul, Piso interfered with his recruitment efforts, and in Crete, Quintus Metellus disregarded his commands, shrugging his shoulders and pretending not to hear him. Well, to effectively combat the pirate threat, Pompey dispersed his forces across the Mediterranean, ensuring that the pirates could not evade the Roman fleet by simply relocating. He appointed 15 legates to patrol specific areas, securing crucial grain routes to Rome. This strategy swiftly brought the western Mediterranean under his control within a mere 40 days. Very efficient. His fleets then advanced east, driving the pirates back to their strongholds in Cilicia. He then personally led the decisive assault on their main base at Coricacium, achieving victory at the Battle of Coricacium and concluding the war in merely 3 months. His reputation for clemency encouraged most of the pirates to surrender without resistance. Following their surrender, Pompey resettled them in cities that had been devastated during the Mithridatic War, such as Soli, which was then renamed Pompeiopolis, the city of Pompey, and Dyma in Greece, as well as towns in Libya and Calabria. And these communities developed a lasting affinity for both Rome and Pompey, integrating into the Roman state while retaining a connection to their benefactor. It was a win-win for everybody. Now in 73 BC, one Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a seasoned lieutenant of Sulla, was appointed proconsul of Cilicia and given command in the Third Mithridatic War. The conflict had reignited in 74 BC, following the death of Bithynia's last ruler, who bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. This event triggered an invasion by Mithridates VI of Pontus and Tigranes the Great of Armenia. Lucullus proved to be a capable military leader, securing several victories. However, there were allegations that he was deliberately prolonging the war for personal gain, and that led to a Senate investigation. By 69 BC, discontent and mutiny were rife among his troops. In 68 BC, Quintus Marcius Rex succeeded Lucullus in Cilicia, while Manius Acilius Glabrio took over in Bithynia and the ongoing war efforts. But unfortunately, Glabrio failed to act decisively when Mithridates recaptured much of Pontus in 67 BC, and then invaded Cappadocia, a Roman ally. In 66 BC, seizing the opportunity to assert control, Pompey leveraged his influence through the tribunate to enact the Lex Manilia. This law granted him sweeping powers across Asia Minor to conclusively defeat Mithridates once and for all, augmenting the authority he already held under the Lex Gabinia. Although the Optimates, or conservative faction as they're also known, were privately alarmed at one individual accumulating so much power, they simply conceded, wary of Pompey's considerable popular support. Lucullus, deeply resentful of being replaced, can't blame him, disparagingly labeled Pompey a vulture who capitalized on the efforts of others. Well, this was a pointed reference to Pompey's new command and his purported role in concluding the war against Spartacus. Meanwhile, Pompey forged an alliance with Phraates III, the king of Parthia, persuading him to invade Armenia. As Mithridates proposed a truce, Lucullus contended that the war had all but ended, at least practically. However, Pompey, seeking more substantial concessions, rejected the offer. Consequently, Mithridates retreated into Armenia, with Pompey hot on his tail. Now, by the end of 66 BC, Pompey had tracked him down and defeated him at Lycus, decisively tilting the balance of the conflict. And then, after the battle, Mithridates, along with a small band of loyal troops, managed to evade capture, and together they fled to Colchis on the Black Sea. It was there he managed to overthrow the Roman-supported ruler of the Cimmerian Bosporus, his own son, Machares, who subsequently took his own life. While during all this chaos, Pompey continued his own military campaign, entering Armenia with the support of Tigranes the Younger. Tigranes the Elder, seeking to avert further conflict, quickly negotiated terms with Pompey. He agreed to pay a significant monetary indemnity and ceded territory taken by Lucullus, additionally permitting Roman troops to be stationed within his domain. In 65 BC, Pompey advanced towards Colchis, intent on capturing it from Mithridates. This campaign required him to first subdue various local tribes allied with Mithridates. After a series of victories, he joined forces with one Servilius, the admiral of his Euxine fleet at Phasis. However, a renewed revolt in Caucasian Albania diverted Pompey's attention, necessitating a strategic retreat to sort out these other disturbances. Following his victory at the river Abbas, he was able to secure terms with the Albanians and truces with the other tribes across the northern Caucasus. Pompey then spent the winter in Armenia, resolving minor territorial disputes between his allies, Phraates of Parthia and Tigranes. In 64 BC, while maintaining a naval blockade to weaken Mithridates, Pompey shifted his focus to Syria. He annexed several wealthy independent cities, integrating them into the new Roman province of Syria. This expansion not only bolstered his wealth and prestige, but it also drew criticism from his political adversaries in Rome, who contended that his actions exceeded the authority that was granted to him. Meanwhile, Mithridates, now elderly and increasingly isolated, found himself besieged in Pantisapaeum by another one of his sons, Pharnaces II. An attempt to take his life by poison failed, reportedly due to his long-standing practice of consuming antidotes as a precaution against such an eventuality. Which, well, I suppose it worked. Good job, Mithridates. But eventually he was killed by his own rebels. In a bid to secure favor with Rome, Pharnaces, that son of Mithridates, sent Mithridates' embalmed body to Pompey. In return, Pompey acknowledged Pharnaces as the ruler of the Bosporan kingdom, and formally aligned him as an ally of Rome, thus marking the end of Mithridates' long-standing challenge to Roman authority. And now we turn to the collapse of the Seleucid Empire, which, following this event, Pompey annexed Syria in 64 BC, a move that, yes, did expand Roman territory, which was the goal, but it also managed to completely destabilize the entire region. A power vacuum allowed many cities to simply claim their own independence. In early 63 BC, Pompey departed from Antioch, advancing southward. He occupied coastal cities like Apamea and moved through the anti-Lebanon mountains to seize control of Pella, Jordan, and Damascus. His further incursion into Judea was prompted by local conflicts that threatened regional stability further. The inhabitants, led by Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, had extended their hostilities into Phoenicia, drawing Pompey's attention and intervention. The conflict in Judea, exacerbated by the ongoing Hasmonean War between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, saw Pompey siding with Hyrcanus. Now, the campaign culminated in the siege of Jerusalem, yes, indeed, that Jerusalem, where Aristobulus' defenders withdrew to the temple. The Romans stormed and subsequently looted the temple. Well, after the siege, Judea was also established as a client kingdom under Hyrcanus, with its northern part integrated into the Decapolis, which was a league of semi-autonomous cities. Now, both Judea and the Decapolis were placed under the jurisdiction of the newly formed province of Syria. Pompey's reorganization of the East included several other significant challenges, by the way. He established the province of Bithynia and Pontus, distributing the remaining territories of Mithridates among Roman allies. In Cappadocia, Ariobarzanes was restored to his throne. Lesser Armenia, previously under Tigranes, was annexed into Galatia, where Pompey's client Deiotarus was installed as a ruler. Additionally, the coastal region of Pamphylia, known for its pirate activities, was combined with other inland areas into Cilicia, which was then divided into 6 administrative parts. Now, all of this territorial and administrative reforms, yes, it was really good for the Roman state. Income going up, missions being accomplished. But in the background, it was very good for Pompey on an individual level. You see, he enhanced his personal wealth, but also his network of patronage. Lots of powerful friends who owed him quite a lot of favors. A solid influence across the newly restructured region. Well, it was time to go home. Pompey's return to Italy in 62 BC. Well, at this time he disbursed substantial bonuses to his troops, totaling around 16,000 talents. After all, they'd worked hard for it. And it was a clear demonstration of his generosity, but also a way to ensure their loyalty. It's hard to be loyal to your boss with empty pockets, after all. However, contrary to some fears that he might emulate Sulla by using his army for political leverage, Pompey dismissed his troops upon their arrival at Brundisium. As he traveled towards Rome, large crowds that gathered to see him indicated his enduring popularity among the general populace, despite the mixed opinions of the Senate. They're all snobs anyway, don't you think? Probably. Well, in 61 BC, Pompey celebrated his 45th birthday with a third triumph, honoring his victories in Asia Minor. Asia Minor as well being the Near East, by the way. During this time, he announced that the newly established provinces in the East had boosted their annual state revenue significantly, almost double, from 200 million to around 340 million sesterces, with an additional one-time payment of 480 million sesterces to the Roman treasury. While Pompey did not disclose the details of his personal wealth, it was no doubt pretty substantial, whichever way you look at it. Low estimates, high estimates, it's pretty high. Well, part of it he actually used to finance the construction of the Theatre of Pompey, destined to become one of the most iconic buildings in ancient Rome. Well, despite all the success, the Senate, well, he was still facing challenges with them. The body refused to ratify the treaties he had negotiated during his reorganization of the East, with opposition spearheaded by the Optimates, including Cato the Younger and Metellus Celer. The latter's opposition may have been influenced by personal grievances, as Pompey had recently divorced Celer's sister, Musia, under rather contentious circumstances. Well, the Senate also blocked a proposal to distribute farmland to Pompey's veterans and the landless urban poor, a measure that was similar to the one that they had rejected in 63 BC. This refusal showed the Senate's confidence in their ability to manage and suppress popular dissent, despite the evident public support for Pompey's initiatives. But when has the Senate ever cared about what the public want? Anyway, while Pompey struggled to counteract the Optimate faction on his own, his political landscape shifted dramatically when Julius Caesar, Marius's ambitious nephew, sought his support for the consulship in 59 BC. Now, Caesar was known for his political acumen and, frankly, unscrupulous tactics, and he recognized the advantage of aligning with Pompey, whose significant influence among the urban electorate could bolster his own political aspirations. The alliance was further strengthened with the support of Crassus. Of course, we're just going to be briefly going over Caesar in this video in his relation to Pompey. If you want the whole story of Caesar, well, you're going to have to go and watch my Julius Caesar video, aren't you? And so now, with the backing of both Pompey and Crassus, Caesar secured one of the two consulships for 59 BC, alongside the Optimate Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. This position allowed Caesar to facilitate the passage of legislation that benefited not only himself, but also his allies, Pompey and Crassus. Of course, favors would certainly be called in. Now, despite being ostensibly the most junior member of what would become the First Triumvirate, Caesar quickly positioned himself as a central figure within this informal alliance, which was primarily aimed at circumventing the dominance of the Optimates. Pompey brought to the Triumvirate his unparalleled military reputation and widespread popularity among the Roman people, key assets in the power dynamic of the Republic. On the other hand, Crassus bought money, and a lot of it. He was immensely wealthy. Think about the Elon Musk of his time, which of course facilitated the building of substantial patronage networks, though He lacked the military achievements that were often crucial for securing political success during this period in Rome. And so, this strategic alliance among the three of them marked a significant realignment of power within the late Roman Republic. And, of course, many major political developments would be in its wake. Now, once Caesar was elected, he swiftly facilitated the approval of a new agrarian law, capitalizing on the support of Pompey's veterans who, by filling the streets of Rome, allegedly coerced the Senate into compliance. Now, this demonstration of force effectively sidelined Bibulus, Caesar's co-consul, who actually opposed the bill, and reportedly he was assaulted in the Forum, leading him to withdraw to what amounted to house arrest for the remainder of his term. Additionally, Caesar secured the ratification of Pompey's reorganizations in the east, and, through the Lex Fatinia, gained governorship of Gallia Cisalpina, Illyricum, and later Gallia Transalpina, following the incumbent governor's death. The triumvirate, however, faced significant opposition from senatorial figures like Cicero, who had been a long-standing ally of Pompey, but diverged over the issue of Publius Claudius Pulcher. Now, Claudius, supported by Caesar and Pompey, targeted Cicero for his role in the extrajudicial executions during the Catilinarian conspiracy, leading to Cicero's temporary exile. Despite this, Cicero returned to Rome 18 months later, arriving back in 58 BC, thanks mainly to Pompey's influence, and subsequently he supported Pompey's appointment as praefectus Annonae during a grain shortage crisis in 57 BC, demonstrating a great deal of gratitude but also pragmatism. Now, by 56 BC, the politics now saw Pompey and Crassus, despite their long-standing rivalry and Pompey's concerns over Caesar's rising military fame, uniting to secure their joint election as consuls for 55 BC. It was a campaign that was marked by the typical violence you expect of Roman political life at the time. Lots of backstabbing. That wasn't too bad of a joke. That was all right. Well, with Caesar's backing, they were successful, and upon assuming office, they orchestrated the passage of laws assigning Crassus to Syria, with a military campaign against Parthia, and Pompey to the provinces of Hispania and Africa, while also extending Caesar's command in Gaul. All three were granted expansive military and diplomatic powers for a period of 5 years, allowing them to levy troops and engage in war or peace negotiations at their discretion. Now, in 54 BC, amidst the tumult of his extensive campaigns in Gaul, Caesar faced a rapidly evolving political landscape back in Rome. Concurrently, Crassus launched his ill-fated campaign against the Parthians. During this period, Pompey experienced personal loss with the death of his wife Julia during childbirth in September of that year. The subsequent deaths of Crassus and his son Publius at the Battle of Carrhae in May of 53 BC significantly altered this delicate balance of power, removing a vital buffer between Caesar and Pompey and setting the stage for direct conflict. And things even escalated further, if they weren't bad enough already, in 52 BC, when violence disrupted the consular elections, leading to their suspension. In the midst of this chaos, the Optimate faction, led by figures such as Bibulus, and supported by Cato, pushed for rather extraordinary measures. They proposed that Pompey be appointed as the sole consul, of course a radical departure from Roman norms, and it was ultimately ratified. Following his appointment, Pompey married Cornelia, the widow of the fallen Publius Crassus, further consolidating his political alliances by appointing her father, Metellus Scipio Nasica, as his consular colleague for the later part of that year. During his consulship, Pompey championed legislation that would have profound implications for the Republic's stability. This legislation aimed to make prosecutions for political violence retrospective, thereby exposing Caesar to potential legal action for alleged abuses during his consulship in 59 BC, once his proconsular immunity expired, of course, upon leaving Gaul. Well, he couldn't have that, couldn't he? In anticipation to these legal threats, Caesar arranged to run for the consulship in absentia for the year 48 BC. However, another piece of legislation, supported by Pompey, required candidates to be physically present in Rome to run for office, complicating Caesar's plans and contributing to the inexorable drift towards civil war in 49. Despite maintaining a facade of cooperation, Pompey regarded his rival, Caesar, as a significant threat. Old friends, well, turning into new enemies, perhaps. And this was a sentiment that was echoed by many within the Senate. In 50 BC, both consuls for the year, Paulus and Gaius Claudius Marcellus, were known adversaries of Caesar. Alongside them, Curio, a plebeian tribune, also opposed Caesar and pushed for legislation aimed at stripping him of his command in Gaul. Allegedly, Caesar managed to circumvent these efforts by bribing both Paulinus and Curio. In a strategic pivot, Curio proposed a resolution. He proposed that both Caesar and Pompey should simultaneously lay down their arms or face being declared enemies of the state. Talk about an ultimatum. And you know what happens to enemies of the state. Well, this proposal appeared to attract those who desired to avoid conflict, but it was frankly untenable for the Optimates, who perceived Caesar as a clear and present danger needing elimination. Don't just let him lay down his arms and get away with it. No, we can't have that. We need to take him out, put him up on that cross. Well, the Senate's rejection of this compromise edged the Republic closer to open warfare, tiptoeing step by step to complete chaos. Of course, they then financed a consular army under Pompey's organization. Now, Pompey's illness during a recruiting stint in Naples and the subsequent public celebrations of his recovery bolstered his confidence in his own popularity and ability to counter any challenges. By December, Caesar had strategically positioned himself in Ravenna, just outside the formal boundary of the Roman Republic, with a veteran legion. The Senate's attitude was uncompromising towards Caesar, influenced by a strong faction that was deeply wary of any concessions. However, many senators also harbored distrust towards Pompey, criticizing him for what they perceived as feeble and ineffective leadership during this critical period. He wasn't there when they needed him, wasn't fulfilling his obligations. And thus on January the 1st, 49 BC, Caesar issued an ultimatum from Ravenna, demanding the Senate accept his compromise, or else. Overconfident in their numerical superiority, over Caesar's forces, the Senate declared him a public enemy on the 7th of January. Thus, in defiance, he famously crossed the Rubicon River into Italy on the 11th of January, 49 BC, a decisive act that effectively launched the great Roman Civil War, signaling his intent to confront the Senate and assert his rights, famously captured by the phrase, "The die is cast." Now, as the Civil War commenced, Caesar, now deemed a rebel, found himself significantly outmatched in terms of resources. He possessed no naval force and commanded only 3 under-strength legions. But in contrast, Pompey was backed by the formidable resources of the Roman Senate and state, and also the support of his clients in the East. Despite his apparent advantage, Pompey's position was less secure than it appeared. He served merely as an advisor to the Senate, which was divided between those seeking a negotiated peace and those who were wary of Pompey's intentions, viewing him with just as much suspicion as they did Caesar. And thus Pompey's military strategies required approval from the consuls, limiting his autonomy. His recommendations were not always heeded, as evident when Cicero declined his request for recruitment assistance, and Cato refused command of Sicily, a key location for controlling Rome's grain supply. This lack of coordinated support certainly did not help Pompey. Now, Caesar, on the other hand, was advancing rapidly towards Rome, and he caught Pompey's defenses off guard. Despite being numerically inferior, Caesar's forces consisted of seasoned veterans, and they were fiercely loyal, whereas many of Pompey's recruits were mercenaries or simply inexperienced recruits. This disparity was highlighted during the siege of Corfinium, where Pompey's Optimate ally, Lucius Domitius, was besieged and ultimately surrendered his 13,000 men to Caesar. These forces, under Asinius Pollio, were subsequently deployed to take Sicily. In response, Pompey retreated from Rome, ordering senators and public officials to follow him to Brundisium. From there he successfully transported his troops across the Adriatic to Dyrrhachium and Thessaly. Meanwhile, unable to pursue immediately due to lack of ships, Caesar focused on securing his rear by defeating Pompeian forces in Hispania before returning to Rome in December of 49 BC. This delay allowed Pompey time to assemble an army nearly twice the size of Caesar's, and maintain control of the sea lanes through his naval superiority. By January 48 BC, however, Caesar managed to cross the Adriatic Sea with 7 legions and landed in southern Albania. After capturing Oricum and Apollonia, he advanced towards Dyrrhachium, Pompey's primary supply base. Pompey managed to arrive in time to thwart Caesar's efforts, and established a fortified camp across the river Apus. The two armies settled into a standoff, neither side eager to initiate hostilities, Caesar due to his military disadvantage, and Pompey preparing to weaken Caesar through attrition, mirroring his earlier strategy against Mithridates. And thus in late March, the deadlock in the region was disrupted When Mark Antony successfully navigated across the Adriatic with 4 legions, landing at Nymphaeum, about 57 kilometers north of Dyrrhachium. Attempting to prevent Antony's forces from joining Caesar, Pompey marched northeast to set an ambush. However, local sympathizers who were loyal to Caesar informed Antony of the trap, allowing him to hold his position until Caesar advanced closer. Faced with the prospect of being sandwiched between 2 Caesarian forces, Pompey strategically retreated. With their forces united, Caesar reassigned his troops. He sent 1.5 legions to Aetolia and Thessaly to secure support and provisions, and 2 more legions under Domitius Calvinus to block Metellus Scipio in Macedonia. Concurrently, Pompey's eldest son, Gnaeus, inflicted a significant setback on Caesar by destroying his fleet at Oricum and Lissus, effectively severing Caesar's supply lines from Italy. Caesar attempted to draw Pompey into open battle at Asparagium, but Pompey declined engagement. Outmaneuvering Pompey the following day, Caesar marched back towards Dyrrhachium, setting up camp before Pompey could arrive. Lacking the necessary siege equipment to take Dyrrhachium, and unwilling to leave Pompey free to attack from behind, Caesar chose to besiege Pompey instead. While Pompey had sufficient food supplies, Caesar's strategic damming of local rivers created a water shortage and limited forage for Pompey's cavalry. The intensifying conditions forced Pompey to make a critical move in late July, breaking through part of Caesar's lines, rendering the siege ineffective. And Caesar then withdrew back to Apollonia. Now, as Metellus Scipio arrived in Thessaly to reinforce Pompey's position, Caesar moved south to confront him, joining forces with Domitius Calvinus. Along the way, Caesar's troops sacked the city of Gomphi. Pompey pursued Caesar to the vicinity of Pharsalus, but hesitated to engage in battle, possibly due to his customary caution. Well, despite being completely outnumbered, Pompey commanded about 38,000 men, with Caesar around about 22,000, but with a significant cavalry advantage. Pompey eventually formed his troops for battle on the 9th of August, planning to utilize his cavalry to outflank Caesar on the left. Caesar, however, had anticipated Pompey's strategy and effectively countered the cavalry charge, which collapsed in complete disarray. The infantry were thus completely vulnerable. Pressured from the front and the left, Pompey's forces were thus overwhelmed, leading to a decisive and frankly catastrophic defeat for his army. Well, after the defeat at Pharsalus, Pompey fled the battlefield and sought refuge in Mytilene, where he was reunited with his wife Cornelia. The battle had seen most of his eastern allies either killed or captured, with the notable exception of the young Ptolemy the 13th, that was the ruler of Egypt. Now, considering Egypt's wealth and strategic importance, and lacking of better options, Pompey viewed it as a viable refuge. Meanwhile, Cato declared his intention to continue the struggle against Caesar from Africa, though many of Pompey's senatorial supporters, including Cicero and Brutus, chose to reconcile with Caesar and simply go back to Rome. From Cyprus, Pompey sailed with a modest fleet towards Egypt, arriving at Pelusium on the 28th of September 48 BC, But Egypt wasn't the best place to be at that time, you see. It was embroiled in its own conflicts, civil wars between Ptolemy the 13th and his sister, Cleopatra the 7th. And yes, it is the Cleopatra that you're thinking of. Well, upon going ashore to meet an official Egyptian delegation, Pompey was tragically betrayed and murdered by Lucius Septimius, a Roman officer who had once served under him, but was then in the employ of the Egyptian army. In the grim aftermath, Pompey's body was hastily cremated on the beach by two of his servants, while his head was preserved as a grim trophy, intended as a political gift to Julius Caesar. It was an assassination that was motivated partly by fears within Ptolemy's court that Pompey might attempt to seize control of Egypt, leveraging the loyalty of the many Roman mercenaries in the Egyptian army, such as Septimius himself. Additionally, Ptolemy's advisors likely saw the murder as a means to get some favor with Caesar in his ongoing conflict with Cleopatra. But, well, if you know the story, you know that it ultimately backfired. Of course, the fate of Pompey's final remains is pretty poignant in itself. His head was eventually returned to his widow Cornelia, who buried it in the family estate in the Alban Hills. The manner of his death led to Cicero to reflect sorrowfully that Pompey's life had persisted beyond his actual power, a tragic end to the once formidable Roman commander's astonishing career. Well, thank you very much for listening to my biography of Pompey. I hope you enjoyed it. You may notice the videos are getting a little bit longer. They're creeping past the 1 hour mark for each one of them, which is okay. It just means more history for you. Thank you very much. Well, I'd also, of course, like to thank my top-tier patrons, as I drop my coins, excuse me. My top-tier patrons being Brit, Charles, Stout Factory, JC, Jeffrey, Wendy, Tim, James, Erin, Scott, Dark, and Ben. Thank you very much. And I will see you in the next video. Good night, everyone.